00191, Revival Phase 2, February 2006. At this point, Theo considered the first stage of Project Revival a success and decided to move it forward into the next phase. The next phase was already in place. It just wasn't launched yet. Theo already created a new company called Revival Insurance and registered it around the world. Its main business would be health insurance, but it would also cover other types of insurance from car, home, disaster, and even small appliances. Theo also included superhero and villain insurance into the coverage his company offered. Theo's goal was to basically take over the insurance industry and put everyone else out of business. It would be simple to do for medical, because Theo's insurance premiums would be almost non-existent if the person qualified, and it would cover everything. The only qualification to get accepted for the insurance was how much money you made or owned. If a person had a net worth of more than $1 million, they wouldn't qualify to be insured by the company. As for people below that line, the insurance premium would be $10 a month and would cover medical, dental, and vision. Was excluding people with money legal? Theo didn't know or care since other insurance companies did far worse things. If people ever complained or attempted to use the government to make him accept customers over that monetary threshold, well, Theo would just charge all of them a ridiculous amount of money and claim it was because they were a liability and the company needed to cover its bottom line. Besides, people with that amount of money should easily be able to afford the other company's insurance or pay out of pocket. As for selling insurance policies to companies to help cover employees, Theo didn't plan to offer that, since the plan was so cheap that anyone could afford it. As for people living below the poverty line with absolutely no disposable income, Theo would cover the policy for free as long as they entered a program to help them improve their situation. Most of the people in those situations were there because they had no other options. As for the people who choose to be there because they didn't want to work or for other reasons, well, Theo couldn't force people to change, but would leave the option open for them. As for the other parts of the medical industry, such as hospitals and pharmaceutical companies, Theo also planned to deal with them too. For hospitals, he didn't plan to force them out of business. That would be stupid. But the for-profit model that most private hospitals ran would be disrupted and the owners wouldn't be happy about it. Sure, they could push back and not accept Revival's insurance, but that wouldn't work very well when Revival would be almost the only insurance provider sooner or later with how their pricing model worked. As for the government trying to step in because it might be considered a monopoly, Revival would just point out that they aren't doing anything except having reasonable prices and not turning down any insurance claims. The government or the media could argue against it, but then Theo would use Vibe to his advantage. The amount of people on the platform was massive at this point and growing quickly with the budget smartphones Tony created. It wouldn't be long before the platform hit 500 million users, and Theo was sure it would reach 1 billion within a year or two at most. Another thing Theo was working on in conjunction with Tony that would affect hospitals was a healing pod. It was a piece of alien tech that Tony was still reverse engineering, but once it was complete, it would replace most general doctors and reasons to visit a hospital. The model Tony was taking apart could do full body scans, treat all minor injuries in hours, if not sooner. As for major injuries or something like a stab wound, it could fix those in a day or more. The best part about the pod was people wouldn't need to use drugs to help with the recovery. Once they came out of the pod, they would be completely healed with no side effects or lingering pain. They also wouldn't need to go through long physical therapy sessions for months on end. They weren't perfect and couldn't heal everything like missing limbs, perform brain surgery, or even remove objects from inside a person like bullets, for example. But if a doctor did the surgery portion to remove the object, the pod could take care of everything else afterwards. As for dealing with the pharmaceutical companies, well, that one was being spearheaded by Tsunade, with help from Tobarama and Orochimaru. Their only goal was to create cures for things pharmaceutical companies didn't. Sure, they could heal most things with medical ninjutsu or giving someone a clone body, but that wouldn't put pharmaceutical companies out of business. If they wanted to do that, they needed to solve the root cause, and that was making medicine that actually cured people and not just held off the symptoms. As for the FDA trials and all of the stuff that goes along with it, Theo didn't worry about it since whatever Tsunade created wouldn't have issues. Plus, if anyone tried to mess with the trails or something else, Tsunade would probably crush them into paste. As for the other arms of Revival's insurance business like car, home, and the others, they would also be reasonably priced and targeted towards people under a certain monetary threshold. As for insurance claims, Theo had a safety measure in place to not have people making false claims. Theo would just send a clone to do a mind scan on someone to make sure they weren't lying about the claim. If they weren't, the claim would be approved and the people would have the money within hours. If they were lying, Theo would cancel their insurance contract, collect evidence they were trying to make a false claim, and turn them into the police for insurance fraud. As for claims that happened because of some type of natural disaster, Theo had plans to investigate them too. But his plan was to help the people affected first and sort out the rest afterwards. With his plans in place and the use of software he created to run most of the back end, Theo silently launched the company with ads being placed on Vibe and nothing else. Theo could have pushed it and made TV commercials, billboards, radio ads, and more. But Theo didn't need to rush the project forward since word of mouth was the best type of advertising. With the Revival project launched, Theo turned his attention to something he was kind of putting off. Well, first he had to wait for Tao and Agatha as they created magical devices, but they were finished a while ago and he was busy with a few things, so he didn't have a chance to use them. The magical devices in question were made to contain the missing Infinity Stones Theo was going to collect. The first one on the list, and the easiest to collect, was the Power Stone. He already knew where it was and only had to deal with the water of the planet since it was hidden in a temple currently submerged underwater. Theo changed into his Ezekiel identity before he met up with Tao and Agatha in Genosha underneath the magic school. Once he arrived, Tao created a portal to Morag for him and Agatha so they could find the stone. As they stepped out of the portal, Tao said, "Contact me once you find it, and I will help make the replacement." Ezekiel glanced back through the portal as he asked, "You sure you don't want to come help us search? It will make it faster." Tao started to close the portal as she said, "It would, but I don't want to walk around on that garbage heap of a planet." Ezekiel glanced around after the portal closed as he said, "It's not that bad." All around him was barren rock while the sky above was filled with thick, dark clouds that only let a tiny bit of pink-tinged sunlight through. A few hundred feet away from him was a vast body of water that was tinged green and bubbled up in certain areas. Ezekiel took it all in for a few moments before he said, "Okay, maybe it is a garbage dump." Agatha nodded in agreement as she asked, "You said the Power Stone is currently underwater, right?" Ezekiel glanced at the sickly green-colored water as he said, "Unfortunately." "How did you talk me into helping with this again?" Ezekiel gave a cheesy smile as he said, "Because I'm your favorite apprentice." Agatha rolled her eyes at that before she said, "You're currently my only apprentice. You know you owe me a favor for this, right?" Ezekiel nodded as he started to cast a set of spells that would help in the search. Agatha also started chanting her own spells, and after a few minutes both of them were finished and ready to explore the murky depths of the water. As they moved towards the water, Agatha asked, "Didn't you say something about trying to narrow down the search area when you first brought this plan up?" "It didn't work. The pollution over the planet was too thick to see through with the satellite." "How is a satellite going to help you see through this water?" Agatha asked as she motioned towards the murky green water in front of them. "Because I commandeered a high-end research satellite from the Kree and had Tao place it about 300 light-years away from Morag." Agatha glanced at Ezekiel as she asked, "And that did what exactly?" "Well, it was supposed to let me see the planet 300 years ago when a majority of the water recedes because of a gravitational disturbance. Unfortunately, I didn't take into account the clouds in the atmosphere, and we weren't able to see through them." "Were you using the time stone with the satellite?" Ezekiel raised an eyebrow as he said, "No." Agatha frowned slightly as she asked, "Then how were you supposed to see the planet 300 years ago? Do you not know what a light year is? A measurement of time?" Ezekiel chuckled before he said, "No, it's a measurement of distance. But it's called a light year because it's measured in the distance that light can travel in one Earth year." Agatha stared at Ezekiel for a few moments before she asked, "And that lets you see Morag in the past, how exactly?" "You really should learn more about modern science-related stuff like Tao. You know that, right?" Agatha pulled out her cell phone as she said, "I can use this just fine." "If that's the case, then how come you always ask me to add people's contacts for you?" Ezekiel asked with a flat look. "Because it's an apprentice's job to do the stuff their teacher doesn't feel like doing," Agatha said with a smug smile. Ezekiel raised up one hand and started to respond, but stopped for a moment before he lowered his hand back down with a slightly defeated face when he couldn't come up with a solid reason to refute her logic. Agatha smiled a little wider before she said, "So about light years and seeing Morag in the past." Ezekiel rubbed the bridge of his nose before he said, "Since the distance a light year travels is so far, you're basically seeing an object 1 year in the past. At 300 light years, you would see something 300 years in the past." That was a pretty good idea. Too bad it didn't help, Agatha said with a slight frown as she looked out over the murky green water. "You could say that again. At least we know it should be near one of the coasts of the land masses that are still above water," Ezekiel said as he glanced out over the vast expanse of water before them. "You go left and I'll go right." "Sure," Agatha said as she moved towards the water before she walked into it and disappeared after a few moments. Ezekiel cast one more glance around the area before he moved towards the water and stepped into it himself. The water touched an invisible barrier around him as he entered it, and once he was fully submerged, he moved his arms slightly as he chanted a spell. After he finished the spell, the barrier around him started to move him, and he guided it deeper into the murky water. 00192. It's not hard to mess with Tony. As Ezekiel sped through the murky water of Morag, the magical sphere around him not only kept him protected from it, but also allowed him to see through it as if it wasn't there. All around Ezekiel were the remains of the once thriving civilization of Morag, now decaying in the murky depths of a disaster of their own making. While originally Ezekiel thought what was mentioned in the movie about the planet was part of the story, but from records he found in star charts from the spaceships he collected, it turned out that Morag really did collapse because of a global warming catastrophe. When Theo first found the information in the star charts he collected, he was a little confused. Why would star charts have that type of information, and what purpose did it serve? Theo somewhat found the answer to his question pretty quickly because it was actually built into the star charts help section. While ship captains modified the star charts they used and added information during their travels, they all originally started with basically the same map. A map that was created and standardized by Nova Corps and a few other galactic organizations. They filled it in with most of the information and also used star charts they collected and verified over the years to expand it and fill in missing information. As for why that information was included in the first place, Theo didn't find that in the charts themselves, but from public information he collected off of Xander's internet. The information was included to give ships general information about any planet they came across so they knew what to expect when they arrived. While it only worked for planets already on the charts, it was still helpful for people who have never been to a certain planet before. Ezekiel glanced around the seafloor at the mostly decayed buildings for a while before he got bored and pulled out his tablet. He opened up the music player and scrolled through a few playlists before he found what he was searching for. After he touched the play button, he left the tablet to hang from its shoulder strap as White Rabbit started to play. Ezekiel hummed along as he continued to search through the murky depths of the water. In Ezekiel's search, he was surprised to find that while the main civilization of the planet died out, the planet still teemed with life. Well, at least the watery depths that covered most of the planet did. He saw many different types of fish, plants, and other creatures alive, and well as they made their homes in the ruins of the now long-dead civilization. Most of the creatures were on the smaller side of things, but a few times Ezekiel ran into larger ones easily the size of a car. While he wasn't scared of the creatures, Ezekiel made sure to steer clear of them since he didn't want to waste time with them. Time slowly passed on Morag, and before Ezekiel realized it, over half a day was wasted in search of the building that contained the Power Stone. While Ezekiel could easily go for a couple days without food as he searched, he decided to call it a day for now. Before he left the water, Ezekiel created a magical tracking spell that he placed on the seafloor below him, so he could start again in the same spot when he came back. With that finished, he made his magic bubble move towards the surface before he used Chakra to help him stand on top of the murky green water. Once he was out of the water, he stopped the music on his tablet before he sent a message to Agatha with magic. After a minute, a portal opened up next to him, and he stepped through it before it snapped closed behind him. "Looks like your search didn't go well," Tao said as she opened another portal before Agatha walked through it. Ezekiel shrugged as he said, "I didn't think we would find it on the first attempt." Agatha nodded in agreement as she said, "At least we know it's near a coastal area on the planet so we don't have to waste time searching the whole thing. So, same time tomorrow? Ezekiel asked as he glanced at Agatha. Sure, but the longer this takes, the bigger the favor you are going to owe me. Also, you need to buy me dinner. I'm starving. I could also go for some food. It's almost dinner time. Tao said as she turned to look at Ezekiel. Ezekiel smiled and waved a hand towards the door as he said, anything to make my masters happy. Ezekiel, Tao and Agatha ended up in Mexico at a random street stall eating tacos. Afterwards, Ezekiel bid them farewell and portaled to Tony's workshop. As he stepped out of the portal, Jarvis said, Mr. Stark, Mississippi Potts and Happy are currently upstairs in the kitchen. Thanks, Jarvis. You're welcome, Ezekiel. As Ezekiel came upstairs from the workshop, he heard Pepper as she said, I just want to go out for a little bit, Tony. I've been cooped up here for 2 months now. But if you go out like that, people will start asking questions, and you were the one who wanted to keep everything a secret for now. Tony said as Ezekiel stepped into the kitchen area. Tony noticed Ezekiel first and frowned the tiniest bit as he glanced towards one of the cameras before he said, Jarvis, we talked about this. Ezekiel waved at everyone as they turned to look at him, and he said, Hi. I sent a text message to your phone as soon as he arrived. Unfortunately, it looks like you turned it to silent mode an hour ago, sir. Jarvis said. Jarvis, Tony said in an annoyed tone as he pulled out his phone to check it. Ezekiel smirked as he moved into the kitchen and asked, What's going on? Pepper rubbed her bulging belly as she said, Apparently I'm on house arrest now because of how noticeable my belly is. Just hide it and it won't be an issue. Tony placed his phone down on the counter before he reached over to rub Pepper's belly as he said, I don't think there's a way to hide this massive thing. Pepper playfully smacked Tony as she said, It's not massive, but it is a little too big to hide anymore. Ezekiel pulled out a hinge seal from his storage seal as he said, Let me see your arm. I want to try something. Both Pepper and Tony glanced at the thin piece of paper with elegant symbols covering it before Tony asked, Why does that kind of look like computer code? Because it is. Now let me see your arm for a moment. Ezekiel said as he looked at Pepper. Pepper glanced at the seal as she held up her hand and asked, What exactly do you want to do? Ezekiel placed the seal on Pepper's arm before he channeled Chakra into it. Once the seal was completely filled with Chakra, he performed a hinge, but forced the transformation onto Pepper as he held her arm. A puff of smoke later, and Pepper looked like a completely different woman, but still very pregnant. Tony's mouth dropped open as he stared wide-eyed at Pepper, who now had long black hair instead of red, along with slightly tanned skin. Her eyes were also brown and almond-shaped instead of her normal round green eyes. Pepper didn't feel anything and didn't notice her skin tone change at first as she asked, Was that supposed to do something? Tony touched Pepper's face as he asked, How did you do that? Pepper touched her own face as she asked, What did he do? I believe my sensors are currently malfunctioning. Jarvis said as one of the cameras refocused on Pepper. Happy, who was also stunned for a few moments, finally recovered and pointed towards a full-length mirror hung near the entryway as he said, You should see for yourself. Tony nodded in agreement before he walked Pepper over to the mirror to see what Ezekiel did. Pepper froze as she looked at herself for a few moments before she asked, Is this really me? It's just a minor trick to change your appearance. It's pretty much an illusion, but a little more real since I matched it to your body. That's why your hair and everything else is the same, just color changed. Pepper checked herself out in the mirror for a bit before she asked, How do I change back? Either pull the seal off your arm or once it runs out of power, which should be in 2 or 3 days. Ezekiel said with a shrug. Pepper turned to Tony with a smile as she asked, I can go out now, right? Tony frowned a little before he said, We can, but if I go out with you, it'll probably start some crazy rumors about me getting a woman pregnant. Pepper poked Tony in the chest as she said, You did get a woman pregnant. I'm just surprised I'm the first one, with how much of a man slut you used to be. Tony sheepishly rubbed the back of his head as he said, I always used protection. Ezekiel smirked as he asked, Are you sure about that? 100%. I never messed around without one, no matter how drunk I was. Happy nodded in agreement as he said, I would also remind him and give him one just in case. Ezekiel raised an eyebrow as he said, Good to know you were looking out for the little man whore in his younger days. Pepper frowned as she said, As much as I am enjoying this conversation, I want to go out. But, Tony's voice trailed off as he turned to Ezekiel before he asked, "Can you do the same thing for me?" "I was just waiting for you to ask," Ezekiel said as the hint of an evil smile crept onto his face. Ezekiel quickly pulled out another seal and placed it on Tony's arm before he repeated the same process he did for Pepper. Once the smoke cleared, Pepper and Happy both stared in disbelief at Tony, who asked, "How do I look?" Pepper and Happy couldn't stop themselves as they burst into uncontrolled laughter that filled the room and caused Tony to frown. Tony turned towards the mirror only to freeze in place as his mouth dropped open at what stared back at him. Tony's whole body had filled out, which included an overly large round waist. His new stocky body included a massive mustache that hit his top lip and almost made his round face look like a real-life Mario. The only thing he was missing was the hat, but Ezekiel did make sure to change Tony's clothes to a red shirt along with denim overalls. Tony tried to speak a couple times, but his mouth only opened and closed for a few moments before he finally whirled around to glare at Ezekiel as he asked, "What the hell? Why do you always have to mess with me?" Ezekiel tilted his head slightly to the side as he said, "I have no idea what you're talking about. You asked for a disguise and I gave you one." Tony pointed at his face as he asked, "How the hell do you consider this a disguise?" "Because no one in the world would think you're Tony Stark." "He has a point, sir." "Shut up, Jarvis. No one asked you," Tony said with a frown. "Understood, sir." Pepper finally recovered as she said, "Honestly, it's perfect. No one would think that's you. It's just too different." Happy nodded in agreement as Tony focused on Ezekiel and asked, "Can you change it to something else?" Ezekiel rubbed his chin as he said, "I guess I could do Tweedledee." "No," Tony said as he cut off Ezekiel and waved his arms in front of himself. "How about Smee from?" "No, just make me look normal," Tony said in an exasperated tone. Ezekiel let out a sigh as he said, "You're no fun. But fine, I'll make you normal. But if you don't like it, that's too bad because I won't change it. As long as I look normal, I won't care what you do," Tony said as Ezekiel grabbed his arm and performed another hinge. When the smoke cleared, Pepper instantly covered her mouth as she tried to hold back a laugh, but failed miserably. Happy was the same way and started to laugh as Tony turned to look in the mirror and froze again. Tony was now bald with the blandest-looking face framed by large round eyes that looked completely dull and lifeless. The red shirt and overalls were now replaced with a white sweater with orange sleeves and the word "Apé" printed boldly on the chest along with what looked like breasts in yellow. Tony frowned, but the face in the mirror barely moved in response, which made Tony frown even more. Ezekiel appeared in the mirror behind Tony with a smile on his face before he said, "I think this suits you. Maybe you should shave your head." "I said make me look normal," Tony said as he spun around to glare at Ezekiel. "That's the most normal person I could think of." 00193, Madara needs a hobby. The next couple weeks flew by while Ezekiel and Agatha searched Morag for the Power Stone. They made decent progress in their search so far, but the main issue was Morag was a massive planet about 5 times the size of Earth. And even though they knew the Power Stone was somewhere just off the coast, the amount of it they needed to search was ridiculous. If it wasn't for the fact they've already cleared about half of the areas they need to search. Ezekiel would probably call off the search for now and figure out a better way to find the thing. Like a topographic 3D model that predicted how the 300-year tidal movement would work. But Ezekiel only thought of that after he spent over a week searching for the thing. The other issue was if the model would even be accurate or not, since he had no idea what actually caused the phenomenon in the first place. It definitely wasn't the planet's orbit or anything else in the solar system, and Ezekiel didn't want to waste time searching for some massive asteroid or something in space. Since that was the case, Ezekiel just stuck with what was already working even though it was slow. After another uneventful search of Morag, Ezekiel came back through the portal Tau created to find Fury seated there as he read through a thick folder full of documents. Fury glanced up from the documents as he said, "We have a problem." Ezekiel nodded in agreement as he asked, "Yeah, we do. Why are you still using paper documents?" Fury's right eye twitched slightly before he said, "I was talking about Banner." "Oh, what about him?" Ezekiel asked as Tau opened up a portal for Agatha. He should be attempting the experiment that turns him into the Hulk soon. That should be in a few months. Unless he gets pressured sooner. Ezekiel said as Agatha walked out of the portal before she greeted Fury and the others. "Aren't you going to stop him?" Fury asked as his right eyebrow raised up. I warned him about it, and I plan to warn him again right before he attempts the experiment. Fury frowned as he asked, why aren't you going to stop him? Because the Earth could use someone like the Hulk to help protect it. Especially a Hulk who is under control of himself and not just a rage monster. What about Banner's blood and all the issues that can come from that? How are you going to stop that from happening? Fury asked as he sealed away the documents in his hands and turned his full focus towards Ezekiel. Ezekiel pointed at Tao as he said, we've discussed it at length and she came up with a magic-based solution. Fury turned his attention to Tao, who was in the process of pouring tea for Agatha before she said, I've created a magic spell that will basically destroy any part of him not connected to his body. Fury frowned as he thought over what that meant before he asked, any part of him? So like blood, hair, or even skin cells? Correct. How would that even work? I know magic can do some pretty incredible things, but you were talking about a spell that would. Fury's voice trailed off as he realized just how absurd the spell sounded. Tao nodded with a faint smile on her face before she said, you're right. It would work at the cellular level. Fury was lost in thought for a few seconds before he asked, can it be dispelled or removed? Only by someone more powerful than me, and I would know the moment that happened. Tao said before she took a sip from her teacup. Fury thought it over for a few more moments before he asked, what about the incident itself? Doesn't it blow up the building Banner is in and kill a bunch of people? We've already taken the liberty to seal off the laboratory itself. If the explosion happens, it will be completely confined to his laboratory. I plan to do a secondary explosion to hide what really happened after I clear the place of people. Ezekiel said as he pulled up his tablet and found the plan he created for the event before he handed the tablet to Fury. Fury was quiet for a few minutes as he quickly read through the entire plan and contingencies plans Ezekiel created for the event. Once he was finished, he handed the tablet back as he said, it looks like you planned for basically anything. Ezekiel pointed towards Tao and Agatha as he said, it was mostly them. My plan was to seal the lab from the explosion and then portal the Hulk somewhere devoid of people. Fury let out a sigh before he said, I should have known. Ezekiel smirked before he asked, was Banner the only reason for the visit, or do you need something else? Fury shook his head before he said, it was just Banner. In that case, I am going to leave and go get some food. Does anyone care to join me? Ezekiel asked as he glanced at everyone else. Everyone decided to join him, and they ended up in Italy at some small family-owned place in the middle of nowhere. Fury still made sure to hinge into a different persona though. While it wasn't completely necessary, Fury was overly cautious and always changed his appearance when he was out in public and not with other S.H.I.E.L.D. agents. After their meal, everyone split up to do their own thing, which meant Ezekiel went home to train, and when he arrived, one of his clones informed him that Madara wanted to spar with him. Ezekiel let out a sigh but still opened up a portal to the main base before he went to find Madara so they could spare. While he could refuse and just ignore him, that would only work for a couple days at most. The reason being is once Ezekiel appeared in the main base, Madara would hunt him down and attack Ezekiel no matter where he found him. It happened twice before when Ezekiel ignored Madara for over a week, and he ended up with a destroyed office both times. While Ezekiel has attempted to redirect Madara's enthusiasm for fighting towards other things like crime fighting, it only works for so long before he gets bored because it's not enough of a challenge. Even though he does help out regularly in fighting against supernatural threats like vampires because they at least put up a fight, Ezekiel quickly found Madara where he thought he would, in the gym sparring with anyone who walked in. Madara was currently in the middle of a spar with Guy, and while Madara looked exhausted, he refused to stop fighting even though Guy wasn't holding back. Ezekiel walked up to Steve, Bucky, and Izuna, who were off to the side spectating the fight, before he asked, how long have they been fighting for? Steve glanced at his watch as he said, almost an hour now. But Madara also sparred with me for about half an hour before Guy showed up. Bucky glanced towards Ezekiel as he asked, I'm guessing you're here because he wanted to spar with you too? As Ezekiel nodded, Bucky said, he called me too. We sparred for about an hour before Steve showed up. So he's been fighting for almost 3 hours? Izuna shook his head as he said, no, he was sparring with Blade when Bucky showed up, and I watched him sparring with Mikhail in his bear form before that. Ezekiel shook his head slightly and patted Izuna on the shoulder as he said, we really need to find your brother a hobby or maybe a girlfriend. Izuna chuckled as he said, "You think anyone would be able to put up with how he acts besides Hashirama?" Ezekiel rubbed his chin in thought before he asked, "So you're saying we should put Hashirama into a female body? Or Madara?" Izuna turned to Ezekiel with wide eyes as Steve asked, "You're not serious about that, are you?" Ezekiel shrugged before he said, "It was just a passing idea. Anyways, I might as well get this over with since I'm here." Ezekiel stepped up to the fighting area and hopped inside before he said, "All right, Guy, let's tag out." Guy disengaged from Madara before he said, full of energy, "Okay, but I want to spar with you once your match is finished." "All right, just give me a bit." Madara smiled as he said, "You finally showed up. I've been waiting here all day." Ezekiel rolled his shoulders and started to warm up his body for a few moments before he said, "My clone told you I was unreachable and would be busy all day. You just didn't want to spar again," Madara said as he charged forward to attack. Ezekiel parried the first blow and countered with a punch to Madara's throat. Madara's opposite hand snaked up and caught the blow before he tried to twist Ezekiel's arm into a hold. Ezekiel easily broke free from Madara's grip when he pivoted backwards and twisted his whole body around as he raised his right leg up into a spinning hook kick. Madara, even in his fatigued state, managed to duck just under the kick and countered at the same time with a punch to Ezekiel's side. Ezekiel grunted from the blow but didn't retreat from the attack and pushed forward to attack again. Madara tilted his head to dodge the blow, but Ezekiel took advantage of his piston to grab the back of Madara's head. As Ezekiel pulled Madara's head down to his raising knee, Madara raised his left hand to block as he sucker punched Ezekiel in the kidney with a right hook. Ezekiel took the blow as his knee broke past Madara's guard and slammed into his nose. Both of them stumbled backwards from each other's attacks before they rushed towards each other again a moment later. While Ezekiel thought he would have a quick and easy spar with a worn-out Madara, that didn't happen as Madara lasted for over an hour before he collapsed on the ground without the ability to get back up. As Izuna came into the ring to carry Madara out, Ezekiel breathed a sigh of relief before he mumbled to himself, "We really need to find Madara a hobby besides fighting." "YSH, that was a mighty display of passion from both of you," Guy said in an excited tone before he burst into laughter and then said, "The springtime of my youth is burning up and I can't wait any longer. Prepare yourself, Ezekiel." Ezekiel glanced up in time to see Guy surrounded in flames that he was pretty sure was caused by an optical genjutsu. A moment later, Guy was running towards Ezekiel at full speed before he jumped into a flying kick as he said, "Dynamic entry." Ezekiel barely dodged the kick before Guy landed and jumped back towards him with a spinning kick towards his head. Ezekiel was on the back foot for about a minute as Guy's intense energy and relentless attacking pushed him into a defensive stance. Once he got used to Guy's rhythm, he started to counterattack, and before long both of them were locked into an intense spar that lasted for over an hour before Ezekiel said, "All right, I surrender." Guy paused mid-punch before he twisted his hand and gave a thumbs up with it as he said, "That was a great spar, Ezekiel. I look forward to the next one." Ezekiel gave a slightly forced smile as he said, "Yeah, me too." As Ezekiel exited the fighting area, a black-haired girl glomped onto him as she said, "That was such a cool fight." Ezekiel smiled down at Gabby and returned her hug as he said, "Thanks, Gabby. I'm glad you liked it." Gabby let go and stepped back from Ezekiel before she started to mimic some of his moves as she said excitedly, "You were all like, BM. And then you did that kick like this, and it was all like WOSH." Ezekiel chuckled as he watched Gabby go through a couple moves before she looked up at him with bright eyes and asked, "Did you come to visit me?" "Of course I did." "Good," Gabby said before she grabbed Ezekiel's hand and pulled him towards the exit of the gym as she said, "Let's go bowling." Ezekiel ended up spending the rest of the night at the main base hanging out with Gabby and some of the other kids. They mostly stayed in the rec room playing different games before they headed to the kitchen for a light snack. Afterwards, he said goodnight to Gabby and the others before he called it a night and went home to sleep. After waking up in the morning and eating breakfast with his family, he created a clone that he sent to school as he headed back to Morag to keep searching for the Power Stone again. 00194. 3 down. Another week passed by uneventfully as Ezekiel and Agatha searched Morag for the Power Stone. It was just a typical day at first for Ezekiel as he combed through the underwater ruins without much enthusiasm for the task that became repetitive at this point. It was only hours later as Ezekiel zoomed around the seafloor that he got excited. In front of him was a building that looked strangely familiar to the one from the movie. Well, it wasn't exactly the same, but it was really close, so Ezekiel moved towards it eager to investigate it. There was a large hole in the main roof that he used to enter the building, and after half an hour of exploring he found what he was looking for. The sealed room that contained the Power Stone, or what he thought was the room. Since it was completely sealed, and he didn't want to ruin the building getting in, Ezekiel decided to get help. First, he traveled to the surface before he channeled magic into the bracelet around his wrist, and a moment later a portal opened up before him. He smiled at Tao on the other side of the portal as he said, "I think I found it." Tao nodded in understanding before she said, "I'll grab Agatha. Give me just a moment." The portal closed, and about a minute later another portal opened up before Tao and Agatha stepped out of it. After the portal closed, Tao and Agatha protected themselves with spells before Ezekiel led everyone down into the sunken temple and the sealed room. Once they were in front of the door, Tao studied it for a few moments before she started to cast a spell. A magic barrier appeared from where she floated and slowly pushed all the water around them back. Once a small 10-foot area free of water was created, did Tao create a portal into the vault. After they stepped through the portal and it closed behind them, Ezekiel asked, "Couldn't you just make a portal in the water? Wouldn't the magic barrier on the portal stop the water from rushing through?" "Yes, but we would have gotten wet as we passed through it because the portal barrier negates the barrier we use to stay protected underwater." Ezekiel frowned as he noticed the spells he used to explore underwater were gone before he said, "I didn't know that. Is it all protective spell shields, or just the one we used for the water?" Ezekiel asked as they all looked towards the Power Stone that was currently sealed behind a purplish-colored barrier. Tao walked up to the pillar where the Power Stone was sealed and walked around it once as she inspected it before she said, "It negates all of them." Ezekiel frowned as he asked, "Isn't that bad if you are portaling into a hostile situation? Wouldn't you want to have some type of barrier active so you can be protected on the other side of the portal?" Tao glanced towards Ezekiel as she asked, "Didn't you read Torvin's comprehensive study of portals and how they function?" "Not yet. I've had my clones focus on runic magic and Fuinjutsu studies. Besides, shouldn't that type of information be in the original book on portals you had me read?" Tao shook her head before she said, "No. That book is only meant to teach you how to create portals and about their basic functions. A portal's ability to remove a protective shield when you use it seems like important information that should be in the first book you read about them." Ezekiel's voice trailed off before he said, "Didn't you say the warnings come at the end of the books? I'm pretty sure that would be considered some type of warning." Tao turned back to the barrier protecting the Power Stone before she said, "And they do. But the basic primer for portals is exactly what it's meant to be." Ezekiel opened his mouth to say more, but Tao gave him a single glance that made him instantly shut his mouth. Tao then turned her attention back to the barrier where she started to cast spells to study it. After a minute or so, Tao nodded to herself before she said, "The barrier is actually powered by the stone itself." Ezekiel frowned as he said, "That's going to be a slight problem then." Tao started to cast a new spell as she said, "Not necessarily. We will just have to provide the fake stone with a tiny bit of power." Agatha nodded in agreement before she said, "Since people are going to be handling the Power Stone a few times, it will be best to make a working imitation instead of what we created for the Tesseract." Tao finished her spell, and the force field around the Power Stone started to dim before it disappeared completely. The ball that contained the Power Stone dropped from its spot, which Ezekiel reached out and caught before he asked, "So lunch, and then we can make a fake replacement for this thing?" Tao put her hand out for the ball as she said, "You mean Agatha, and I will make the replacement. You're going to be studying since it seems like you need to expand your magical knowledge more." Ezekiel smiled sheepishly as he handed the metal sphere to Tao before he said, "I could still help while my clones read instead. In that case, you can make us tea while we work," Tao said as she opened another portal back to Earth. Once back on Earth, they picked a place in Genosha to eat at before they went back to the Mystic School. In the sealed chamber beneath the school, they started work on making a fake Power Stone. The first step was to use a magic spell to unlock the sphere before they removed the Power Stone and placed it inside the magic device they created. The device served a couple purposes. The first one was sealing away the Power Stone's unique energy signature. The second purpose of the device was to let someone use the stone if needed, like the Eye of Agamotto or the device they created for the Space Stone. Once the Power Stone was sealed in the device properly, Tao and Agatha researched a proper way to create a functional fake. It took a couple weeks, but with the help of a crystalline spell container they created, they were able to make it. It would function basically as a battery until its power was fully depleted, and then the container would disintegrate. As for making it convincing, all they had to do was use the Power Stone to charge it. It not only made the crystalline container look almost exactly like the Power Stone, but it also gave off the same feeling as the stone. They did test it a few times to make sure it would work as intended, but if someone tried to use a big burst of power, it would instantly drain it, and it would destroy itself. After they were done, Tao sealed the fake stone back in its ball and placed it back inside the temple on Morag. Once that was completed, Theo prepared himself for the next stone he wanted to collect. It was also the only stone that had requirements for collecting. While what Theo wanted to attempt was all theory-based and might not work in the end, Theo would rather try his idea than even consider doing the known method to acquire the Soul Stone. He did have a backup plan for the Soul Stone if this one didn't work out, though. Theo, in his Ezekiel persona, was in the medical base laboratory as he watched the clone body he had commissioned be removed from its incubation chamber. It was a modified male clone body made with normal human DNA only and aged to be around late teenager. After the clone was removed from the chamber, cleaned up and dressed in some clothes, it was placed into a wheelchair. Ezekiel then took the handles of the wheelchair and took the clone with him to the portal room where he created a portal to Genosha. Once there, he made his way to the magic school and into the hidden chamber below it, where he met up with Tao and Agatha. When he arrived, Tao glanced over the clone body as she asked, "Are you sure about this?" "Not really, but it can't hurt to try it." Agatha studied the clone body for a few moments before she said, "Well, if it doesn't work, we still have Plan B." Ezekiel nodded as he said, "Exactly." Tao glanced one more time at the clone body before she opened up a portal to Vormir. After they stepped through the portal onto the planet, Ezekiel took a moment to enjoy the view as he looked out over the purple-tinted sky, filled with clouds. After a few moments of taking it all in, he turned towards the wheelchair before he used a spell on it. The wheelchair lifted off the ground and hovered there before Ezekiel grabbed the handles and started walking towards a mountain in the distance. After they walked for a few minutes, Tao said, "You know, we can just portal to the top of that thing." Ezekiel paused for a few moments before he turned back to looking at Tao as he said, "I just assumed this was as close to it as we could portal." Tao spun her hand in a circle as she said, "I was more concerned with getting to the planet the first time. Now that we are here, I have no issue portaling us anywhere on the planet." The portal opened up next to Ezekiel and showed the top of the mountain a moment later before Ezekiel said, "Oh, I guess I should have asked." Tao nodded in agreement before she waved towards the portal and said, "After you." After everyone passed through the portal and it closed behind them, a ghostly figure in a billowy black cloak floated towards them. As the specter came closer, its eerie voice echoed as it said, "Welcome, Agatha Harkness." The specter landed before everyone before it turned its cloaked head towards Tao and said, "Welcome, Saskia, current Sorcerer Supreme of Earth." It then turned its attention to Ezekiel and the clone before it paused for a few moments as it studied both of them closely. After a few moments, it finally said, "I'm not sure who you are. This has never happened before. It's okay. I heard 1 in 3 men suffer from performance anxiety, but they do make a pill that can fix that issue now." The specter tilted its head to the side slightly as it stared at Ezekiel a while longer before it said, "Strange. I always know who comes here, and yet you're invisible to me." The specter glanced towards the clone body in the wheelchair as it said, "This one I can understand, for it has no soul, but you have a soul that I cannot see through properly. Well, I can help you out. My name is Ezekiel, and I come from Earth." The specter floated around Ezekiel as it tried to look through him while it mumbled to itself, "Strange. Strange. Why are you strange?" "I'm Ezekiel. Strange isn't here right now," Ezekiel said with a smirk. The specter stopped in front of Ezekiel before it asked, "What is your purpose here?" Ezekiel smiled wide as he said, "I'm here for you, Herr Schmidt." The specter floated back slightly before it removed the cloak that covered its head. The Red Skull stared at Ezekiel for a few moments before he asked, "You know who I once was?" "Of course I do. Why else would I come to this planet in the middle of nowhere?" "You didn't come to seek the Soul Stone?" the Red Skull asked as he stared intently at Ezekiel. Ezekiel shook his head as he said, "That's a secondary interest. I came for you first, and we can worry about the Soul Stone afterwards." The Red Skull stared at Ezekiel for a while as if he was trying to see through him before he asked, "How did you know I was here?" "I have a gift of foresight and found you through that." "Why did you search me out?" the Red Skull asked as he glanced at Tao, Agatha, and the clone body. "Because Hydra is about to reawaken from its hibernation and it needs a proper leader. A leader people can look up to, one who is known and feared around the world." Ezekiel said with a slight smile. "People still know who I am?" the Red Skull asked with interest. "While your overall plan failed, the world still knows you as the man who killed Captain America." "I didn't kill him." "Maybe you didn't, but the history books say otherwise. You are known as the evil mastermind who almost took over the world, and you were only stopped because of the heroic sacrifice of the captain," Ezekiel said with a shrug. The Red Skull glanced at the clone body as he asked, "Did you bring that body for me?" "Yes. Our goal is to anchor your soul into it." The Red Skull shook his head before he said, "It won't work. I am just a shell of my former self." Ezekiel glanced towards Tao before he asked, "What do you think?" Tao started to cast spell after spell before she started to walk around the Red Skull as she studied his wraith-like body. After about a minute she said, "His soul is damaged, but mostly intact. There shouldn't be any issue." Ezekiel turned back to the Red Skull as he asked, "Are you ready to have a body again?" 00195, meeting a guardian? Within a few minutes, Tao was able to place the Red Skull's soul into the clone body and anchor it in place. Afterwards, Ezekiel pushed the Red Skull still in the wheelchair over to the edge of the cliff. He paused for just a moment before he picked up the Red Skull and tossed him off the cliff as he said, "Hopefully this works. If it doesn't, you can still use your original plan. But I still think this was a little cruel," Agatha said as she watched the Red Skull plummet towards the ground. Tao shook her head before she said, "If we had woken him up before he was thrown off the cliff, that would have been cruel. But this was merciful. Considering what he did in his life, he is getting off pretty easy if you ask me," Ezekiel said as the Red Skull slammed into the ground far below. Ezekiel glanced down at the scene far below before he said, "Would you look at that?" Tao glanced over the edge as she asked, "Look at what?" "I always thought they toned down the scene in the movie so kids could watch it. But it really looks like a body doesn't just explode apart when dropped from such a height. I don't even see any blood," Ezekiel said as the pillars behind them started to pulse into the sky above them. "It has to do with the mass of the object and how gravity affects it," Tao said as she glanced back at the pillars before she asked, "I'm guessing that's supposed to happen?" It did in the movie. A vortex of power formed in the sky above them as it started to glow before a massive surge of energy blasted out of it that covered the whole sky. A moment later, Ezekiel, Tao, and Agatha were laying in some water a distance away from the mountain they were just on. As they sat up, Ezekiel instantly lifted up his right hand to see if they collected the Soul Stone. When he found nothing, he frowned before he stood up and glanced at Tao and Agatha. Both of them were glancing at the glowing orange stone that was in between where all of them were placed. It was just laying underneath the water, perfectly spaced from each of them. Ezekiel moved towards Tao and Agatha to help each of them up before he said, "It's nice to see that my theory was correct." As they each performed a spell to dry off their clothes, Agatha said, "You never really explained what your theory was. You just told us the movie logic was stupid and sacrificing a person you love doesn't make sense." Ezekiel nodded as he glanced towards the Soul Stone and said, "I was positive Red Skull was fucking with Thanos because of the type of person he was. Even if the Soul Stone made the Red Skull act as some type of guide, it didn't control him directly." As both Agatha and Tao started to perform a few spells to test to make sure it was the Soul Stone, Ezekiel said, "I am pretty sure the Soul Stone just gave him a soul form, and that was it. As for him telling people they needed to sacrifice the person they love for it, that was him just being a bitter asshole." As Agatha finished her first spell, she asked, "And that was your theory? He was an asshole?" Ezekiel shrugged as he said, "Well, My theory was that you just needed to sacrifice a soul to get the soul stone. Just think about how easy it is to get the other stones, and then this one has some stupid test to it? That just seemed like added movie drama to me. Tao nodded as she finished her spell and said, "That makes a lot of sense, but now we need to determine if this gem is like the one from the comics or not." Tao pulled out the device they made to contain the soul stone, and after it was sealed in its new home, Tao turned to Ezekiel as she said, "So that's 4 down." Ezekiel nodded as he said, "I'm pretty sure Thanos has the Mind Stone in that scepter from the movies. So hopefully we can collect that sooner or later when it comes to Earth." "If it comes to Earth, you mean, right? I assume you plan to interfere when Thor comes to Earth, correct?" Tao asked as she stored the Soul Stone's container away. Ezekiel smirked as he said, "You think I would miss out on that? Besides, the Rainbow Bridge getting destroyed causes a lot of issues in the greater universe I don't want to deal with, so it would be best to stop that." Tao nodded at that before she shared a glance with Agatha and asked, "And you plan to use that chance to mess with your girlfriend's father, right?" "She isn't my girlfriend. And yes, I plan to fuck with Odin while I help out Thor and maybe Loki. It depends on how much of a dick that guy is," Ezekiel said as Tao and Agatha both shared a smile. Ezekiel waved them off before he said, "So besides the Mind Stone, which we have no idea where it currently is." Agatha cut him off as she said, "We just need the Reality Stone to complete the set." Tao nodded as she said, "As for the Reality Stone, you said we just need to wait for the convergence to happen and we can get it." "Yup, but we'll have to deal with the Dark Elves when that happens. I wonder if they'll even appear if we seal away the stone before they can sense it." Tao started to open a portal back to Earth as she said, "We could always wait to seal it until after we bring it out of the pocket realm it's sealed inside of." As the portal opened up, Ezekiel said, "Wait, we need to hide the evidence that we were here." Tao thought about it for a moment before she closed the portal and opened a new one to where the Red Skull was. After they stepped through the portal, Ezekiel sealed the body away before he used a spell to remove the little bit of blood that remained afterwards. As Tao was about to open a portal back to Earth, the engines of a spaceship flared loudly in the distance. Tao stopped making a portal as she glanced at Ezekiel and asked, "Didn't you say no one was supposed to know about this place?" Ezekiel shook his head before he said, "No. I said, no one should know that the Soul Stone is here. As for the planet, it's on a lot of star maps and marked as not habitable." Ezekiel glanced into the distance at the spaceship that was in the process of making its descent from the atmosphere before he said, "Let's go see who it is." Tao glanced at the ship before she asked, "Do you really want to waste time on this?" Ezekiel shrugged as he said, "Maybe it's some space pirates and we can confiscate their ship in the name of justice and turn them in for the bounty at the same time." Tao rolled her eyes at that before she opened a portal to Earth as she said, "Just use the bracelet when you want a portal back to Earth. Agatha and I are going to focus on researching the Soul Stone and see if that other plan you have will even work." "All right, good luck," Ezekiel said before his afterimage faded away. Tao glanced towards the direction of the ship before she looked at Agatha and asked, "What sounds good for lunch?" As they stepped through the portal, Agatha asked, "How about that ramen place in Genosha?" Ezekiel moved in the direction of the spaceship for a little while before he came to a stop by some large rocks. It gave him a spot to hide at, and at the same time observe the ship that was in the process of making its descent. About 5 minutes later, the ship leveled out and flew towards the mountain next to Ezekiel. It flew around it a couple times before it found an even spot on one side of the mountain and started to lower down as it prepared to land. Ezekiel wasn't in a great spot to observe the ship's landing spot, so he quickly moved towards the area as he used his skills to be as stealthy as possible. It didn't take long for him to reach the area and hide among some larger rocks as the ship finished its final descent before it touched down on its landing gear. After about a minute, a door opened up from the back of the ship, and Ezekiel was forced to move to get a better view. As Ezekiel moved to a new position, someone walked out of the ship onto the ramp, and Ezekiel could only smile to himself. A beautiful green-skinned woman stepped onto the ramp as she looked around the area. Her mostly red hair was loose and fell just past her shoulders and bounced around slightly as she walked. The red was highlighted by her green skin and piercing brown eyes. She was in a black-colored outfit which consisted of pants, a halter top, and leather-like vest. Ezekiel observed her for a few moments as he decided what to do. On the one hand, it was an opportunity to make a potential ally. On the other hand, he wanted to stay off Thanos' radar for as long as possible. While he wouldn't have to deal with the man having a bunch of easy power-ups, Thanos was still powerful on his own, and if he was anything like his comic book version, well, he would be even more of a hassle to deal with. As Gamora pulled out an ancient-looking scroll, Ezekiel made his decision and disappeared from his hiding spot. As Gamora looked over the scroll, a voice said, "You should be more careful with that. It looks really old." A knife appeared in Gamora's offhand as she swung it behind herself and twisted around to see who snuck up on her. As she looked around in confusion to find no one, she heard behind her, "You should be careful. Knives are sharp." Gamora kicked out behind herself before she quickly spun around to find no one again. A voice filled with concern said, "I know you're supposed to be an assassin, but you're being a lot more aggressive than the ones I normally hang out with. If you want to make friends, you should probably tone it down a bit." Gamora's eyes narrowed as she glanced around and said, "If you know who I am, then you know I have no need for friends." Now that's just sad. Everyone could use a friend or two, even if they personally might not think that they do. Gamora glanced around herself as she said, "How about you stop hiding and show yourself?" "I'm not hiding. You just haven't been looking in the right direction," the voice said with a hint of mirth. Gamora's head snapped upwards to see a man hanging upside down by his feet, which were attached to the hull of her ship. He smiled at her as he casually waved with one hand as he said, "Yo." Gamora's hand flicked out a moment later, which sent a knife flying towards Ezekiel's head. He caught the knife without much effort and used a chakra exercise to dexterously flip it around his fingers as he said, "You should be careful with these things. They're sharp." Gamora's eyes narrowed and she started to reach for the gun strapped to her waist as Ezekiel said, "I wouldn't do that if I were you. I only came here to talk." When Gamora's hand reached her gun, she felt the coldness of metal against her throat, which made her whole body tense up as she watched Ezekiel above her fade away, and he said from behind her, "If you feel like talking with me, remove your hand from your gun. Otherwise, I'm going to leave since this will be a waste of time." Ezekiel's voice trailed off as the knife was removed from Gamora's neck. Gamora relaxed her body and moved her hand away from her gun before she slowly turned around. Ezekiel was about 20 feet away sitting on a rock as he twirled Gamora's knife around his hand with practiced ease. He smiled at her as he asked, "So do you want to talk? What do you want?" "Straight to the point it is. Did you come here for the Soul Stone?" Ezekiel asked. Gamora's eyes narrowed a tiny bit and her hand twitched towards her gun for a moment before she asked, "Soul Stone? What's that?" "It was the only thing worth coming to this place for." "Was?" Gamora asked as she studied Ezekiel more closely. "I just helped someone collect it," Ezekiel said with a shrug. "And where are they now?" "My sensors picked up a weird power surge from the planet, but didn't pick up another ship in the system," Gamora said as she cautiously glanced around. "They left after they collected the Soul Stone." "How long ago, and why did they leave you behind?" Gamora asked as she turned her attention back to Ezekiel. "Right after your ship entered the atmosphere." Gamora's eyes narrowed as she asked, "They have a stealth ship that my sensors couldn't pick up?" Ezekiel lifted his arm up and created a portal in front of himself that opened right in front of Gamora, who jumped back in surprise as she pulled her gun out. Ezekiel smirked and stood up before he walked through the portal to appear in front of Gamora, as he said, "There are far faster ways to travel the universe than a spaceship." As the portal disappeared, Ezekiel held up Gamora's knife to her by its blade as he said, "You can have this back. The craftsmanship is below my standards." Gamora slowly holstered her gun before she cautiously took the knife back from Ezekiel and asked, "Who are you?" "Oh yeah, I didn't introduce myself because someone was being grumpy," Ezekiel said before he smiled as he stuck out his hand and said, "I'm Ezekiel. Nice to meet you." "Gamora, but you seem to know that already," Gamora said as she glanced at Ezekiel's outstretched hand. "In my line of work, it pays to know useful information," Ezekiel said as he dropped his hand back down. "And what exactly do you do?" Ezekiel lifted his hand and a card appeared between two fingers which he handed towards Gamora as he said, "You can consider me a problem fixer." Gamora hesitantly took the card which had a net ID for Xander, the Kree, and the Shi'ar Empire printed on it, as Ezekiel said, "That's how you can contact me if you ever need to hire me." Gamora glanced up from the card, but Ezekiel was only an afterimage that faded away a moment later. Gamora glanced around for Ezekiel for a few moments before she headed back into her ship and prepared to leave the planet. While she originally planned to confirm the Soul Stone was here and then destroy the information about it, now she planned to tell Thanos that someone else already has it and maybe give him Ezekiel's card. 00196. Sending a message. Theo was in his training room as he practiced Fuinjutsu for the day. For the past 2 weeks, he was basically left alone as Tao and Agatha studied the Soul Stone and its effects. Sure, they would pop by once in a while, but the majority of their free time was spent researching the stone. Theo didn't mind since that meant no practice with Tao, or in other words, he wouldn't be treated as a punching bag. While he knew what her intentions were and overall he even appreciated it, but that didn't mean he liked being bruised all over each day. It didn't matter how quickly he healed, it still sucked. As Theo worked on making another explosive tag, his phone rang. He set down his brush before he answered it and said, "What's going on, May?" "Really? Give me a couple minutes," Theo said before he hung up his phone. After he sealed up his ink container and cleaned his ink brush off, Theo stood up and transformed into Ezekiel before he created a portal and stepped through it. On the other side, he found May Terumi and an unfamiliar man in a suit. The man stared with his mouth hanging open as Ezekiel walked towards him and asked, "I was told you have something for me, and it couldn't be handed to my assistant." The man finally recovered and shakily reached into his coat pocket before he pulled out some papers and handed them to Ezekiel. As Ezekiel took them, the man said, "Teach this. Is a Sue summoned to appear before the Senate Judiciary Committee on Friday?" "Why?" Ezekiel asked as he looked at the documents that didn't explain anything. "I'm just here to serve you the papers," the man said before he turned around and made a beeline for the elevator. Ezekiel glanced over the papers one more time, and after the man left, he asked, "I wonder why he was so scared." May raised an eyebrow as she said sarcastically, "I doubt you just appearing out of thin air was the cause." Ezekiel nodded as he said, "You're right, of course. Something like that wouldn't scare someone. You must have hit on him before I arrived, didn't you?" Ezekiel asked with a smirk. May's eye twitched as she said, "He's below my standards. I still think you and Kakashi." May cut him off as she said, "That man is a pervert. Always reading those stupid novels." Ezekiel shrugged as he said, "Maybe, but I'm sure he might stop if the right woman entered his life and he didn't need those novels anymore." Ezekiel only stayed for a few more minutes to check a couple things before he portaled back to his training room. His first order of business was to find out what the summons was about. It didn't take long, and he was surprised he didn't think about it before. While he was concerned about the government and potential villains appearing, he forgot to monitor for things that concerned his company and his Ezekiel persona. It was an oversight on his part that led to the current situation. While monitoring for both of those things wouldn't have prevented this from happening, he would have at least had a warning something was coming. After he collected information about what was going on, Ezekiel said about making sure it wouldn't happen again. Well, he probably couldn't stop something like this from happening again, but he would at least know about it beforehand next time. After that was done, Theo scanned the summons documentation before he sent them and the information he collected to his mother. About 10 minutes later, his phone rang, and he answered it as he asked, "So what do you think?" "I was planning to go alone." "Okay, you're right. I'll see you Friday morning then, at the office." "No, I was planning to portal in after it was supposed to start." "All right, we'll do it your way then. But I still plan to stream the whole thing on Vibe." "No, I'll follow your directions on everything else. But I'm going to live stream that circus they're trying to put on." "Okay. Yes. I understand. Okay, see you Friday." After Ezekiel hung up the phone, he let out a sigh before he said to himself, "She doesn't even know who I really am, and she still somehow treats me like I'm her kid. It's probably her motherly intuition, or it's because you act like a child half the time." Ezekiel turned around to see Tao with a smirk on her face as she stepped out of a portal. Agatha followed after her before it closed behind them. Theo smiled at both of them before he asked, "You don't normally visit at this time. Did something happen?" Tao nodded as she said, "We figured it out." Ezekiel excitedly jumped out of his seat as he asked, "Really?" "With no issues. There will be a few issues, mainly soul damage. We could fix it with the soul stone, but recommend against that since we still don't fully understand its powers." Ezekiel nodded in understanding before he said, "So when do you want to do it?" Tao shared a knowing glance with Agatha before Tao asked, Can't wait to recuse your girlfriend, can you? Ezekiel flushed slightly, which made both of them snicker before Ezekiel said, will you both grow up? Tao and Agatha both burst into laughter at that, as Ezekiel let out a sigh. A few moments after Tao stopped laughing, she said, we can go now if you want. Ezekiel nodded as he said, all right, let's go. Within half an hour, they were all under the magic school of Genosha, where Tao opened a portal to hell. Hela smiled a tiny bit when Ezekiel stepped out of the portal and said, you're early. Ezekiel pointed over his shoulder towards Tao and Agatha as he said, we came to spring you from your prison. Hela's eyes lit up as she asked, you figured out a way? Ezekiel turned towards Tao and Agatha as he said, they've been working on it. Tao moved closer as she said, we figured out a way to free you from the chains, but you will still suffer from some minor soul damage. Agatha nodded in agreement before she added, unfortunately, all our tests concluded that soul damage would happen whenever the chains are forcefully removed. Hela nodded in understanding before she said, it's better than being trapped here for who knows how much longer. Tao pulled out the soul stone in its container before she said, this will probably hurt. A lot. It's fine. I'm used to pain. Hela said as she glanced at the small rune-covered box. As Tao and Agatha pulled out a couple more items, Ezekiel went around and stored everything he brought for Hela. The custom TV, pub table and chair, along with the small display case and the handful of Gundam models Ezekiel gave Hela. They were all the lowest grade model kits that were single color and easily snapped together, but Hela still liked them. As Ezekiel did that, Tao and Agatha set up a small array with the soul stone as the focus. After a few more minutes, everything was ready, and Tao said, prepare yourself. Hela nodded stoically before Tao opened the container for the soul stone. The orange light of the soul stone slowly filled the array, and before long it started to coat the chains attached to Hela. At first it seemed like nothing was happening, but slowly the chains started to dissolve away near Hela. As the part connecting a chain to Hela disappeared, it would drop to the ground with a heavy thud. Hela, for her part, gritted her teeth each time the orange light touched her. It didn't look like it did anything at first, but when Ezekiel used a spell to observe souls, he saw what really happened. It was dissolving the part of Hela's soul where the chain was attached. It was tiny compared to her actual soul, but there were hundreds of chains attached to her body. Ezekiel watched in quiet anticipation as chain after chain detached and dropped to the ground. When the process was about halfway through, he asked, why aren't the chains being completely destroyed? If that happened, Odin would know something was going on. Agatha said as Tao focused on her task of removing the chains. Oh, okay. So the chains will just stay there once this is all finished, and Odin won't realize Hela is free. Only for half an hour or so before they all disappear at once. Agatha said as she studied Tao's progress. Ezekiel stood there and watched in silence for moments before a smirk slowly crawled across his face as he thought of something. Hela, for her part, didn't utter a sound throughout the whole process. Once she was free, Hela breathed a deep sigh of relief before she smiled. It wasn't her normal hint of one she had either. This one was a real smile filled with joy. Her eyes moistened a tiny bit as she glanced at everyone and said, thank you for your help. Ezekiel smiled as he said, you're welcome. Tao smacked Ezekiel in the back of the head as she said, you didn't do anything. Now shut up and go hug your girlfriend. Hela flushed the tiniest bit as she turned her head away slightly as Ezekiel shot a glare at Tao. A moment later, he moved closer to Hela as he asked, are you ready to get out of here? Hela turned to face Ezekiel with a genuine smile before she said, more than anything. Ezekiel glanced around to make sure they weren't leaving anything behind before he asked, since Odin will be coming here soon to find out what happened, how about you leave him a message? Hela frowned slightly as she spat out, I have nothing to say to that bastard. Ezekiel smirked before he said, you're missing the point of the message. After Ezekiel explained what he meant, Hela excitedly got to work and created a message for Odin. As she was doing that, Tao and Agatha collected everything they brought with them. Once everyone was finished, Tao created a portal to Genosha, and Hell was left completely empty for the first time in millennia. After they arrived in Genosha, Ezekiel turned to Hela and asked, so you're finally free. What do you want to do now? Hela frowned slightly before she said, I have no idea. Ezekiel nodded in understanding before he said, well, it's fine. There's no rush. How about we go eat a late lunch and then find you a place to live afterwards? Okay, Hela said with a hint of excitement in her voice. About an hour later, as Ezekiel, Hela, Tao, and Agatha were finishing up lunch, the environment of hell was disturbed as a massive rainbow-colored beam of light slammed into the ground. When the beam dissipated a few moments later, Odin, Thor, Loki, and a whole host of warriors were there in battle formation. Everyone was extremely tense as they looked around for an enemy, but only found a message instead. Carved deep into the ground and filled with necroswords to help it stand out was a simple message that read, "Clean your neck and wait for me, old man." Thor glanced at the message along with everyone else before he asked, "What's going on, father?" Odin let out a sigh before he said, "Let's head back. I have something important to tell you and your brother in private." A little while later, as Odin was explaining to Thor and Loki about their older sister, Ezekiel was with Hela and Genosha as he showed her the penthouse suite she could live in for however long she wanted. It was part of the casino that was almost finished being built and was on the top floor in one of the VIP suites that wasn't furnished yet. Theo's original plan was to turn this suite into Ezekiel's home when he needed to entertain guests or something. But now that Hela was free, he decided to let her have it. Hela glanced around the massive open concept design for a bit before she said, "Are you sure I'm not imposing? I really only need a place to sleep. This place seems a bit too much." Ezekiel shook his head with a smile before he said, "Not at all. I own the whole building and technically most of the property on the island. Besides, if it's too big, just fill it with stuff you want or turn part of it into a training room or something." "Okay, I'll gladly accept your generous offer then. Does it include a bed?" Hela asked as she glanced around at the empty living room area. "No, you have to sleep on the floor," Ezekiel said as a joke. "Okay, I understand." Ezekiel's head whipped around to see the tiniest hint of a smile on Hela's face as her eyes curved up in mirth. Ezekiel smiled back as he said, "Was that your first joke? Should we celebrate?" "Yes, by getting me a bed." "Wow, I expected her to be forward. But it's only been, what, 2 hours, and you're already asking Ezekiel to join you in bed," Tao said in a teasing tone as she walked out of one of the rooms followed by Agatha. Hela turned away with a hint of a blush as Ezekiel said, "She asked for a bed to sleep on." I'm sure that's exactly what she meant. "Now remind me again why you're giving Hela this place, and you never once offered something similar to either of your masters," Tao asked before Agatha added on. "The ones who look after you and make sure you don't cause any problems." Ezekiel gave both of them a flat look as he asked, "Really? You both want a penthouse suite? Don't you both have your own homes already?" Tao glanced out at the beautiful view of the ocean below as she said, "I have a little place I call my own, but something like this would be a nice retreat sometimes. I'm sure Ebony would enjoy a place like this too." Ezekiel glanced between his teachers before he let out a sigh and then said, "Fine, I'll allocate the other 2 suites on this floor for each of you. It can be your own personal floor from now on." Tao and Agatha shared a smile and a nod before Tao asked, "So are we going bed shopping now? I have to buy both of you beds too?" Ezekiel asked in exasperation. "Stop acting like you aren't going to use stolen money for it in the first place," Tao said as she headed towards the door. Agatha nodded as she added, "Since we are getting a penthouse suite, we should probably go shopping to furnish the whole thing." "Great idea. Come along, you two, we have a lot of places to visit," Tao said as she opened the front door and looked back at Ezekiel and Hela. Hela glanced at Ezekiel as she asked, "Are they normally like this? I might be a negative influence on them," Ezekiel said as he rubbed the back of his head. 00197. A day with Hela. 1/2. Shopping with Tao, Agatha and Hela turned into a crazy adventure that lasted more than 12 hours. They traveled to over 30 countries and hundreds of stores as Tao and Agatha picked out everything they wanted. It wouldn't have been that bad, but whenever a store didn't have the item in stock, they would find another store with it and portal over to get it. That also didn't include the random antique stores they visited. If Ezekiel didn't have a large amount of storage seals, it would have been even more trips to move everything around. At least it was only Tao and Agatha who were being ridiculous in what they wanted. Hela, on the other hand, only wanted 2 things, functionality and comfort. She still ended up picking things that matched and complemented each other, but it was nowhere near what Tao and Agatha did. Once they finished shopping for furniture, Ezekiel had to excuse himself for a few minutes to go replace his clone that was with his family. Once he had a fresh clone in place, he met back up with everyone to eat and then unload their furniture for them. By the time he was done, he was mentally exhausted and ended up laying down on the massive couch in Hela's living room. The custom media device he created for her was also in the living room and acted as her TV. Since the thing was already large enough and worked great, Hela saw no reason to upgrade or try and replace it. Hela was seated not far from Ezekiel as she watched a Gundam show and ate some snacks they picked up. While Ezekiel spaced out as he mindlessly watched the TV, Hela said something that made him tilt his head towards her as he asked, "What did you say?" "I want to get some more Gundam models." Ezekiel sat up as he asked, "You want to get some of the cooler, higher-end models that have a lot more parts and take longer to build?" Hela looked at Ezekiel as she said, "Maybe. I'd want to check them out first." Ezekiel stood up from the couch as he said, "All right, I know the perfect place to go." Ezekiel led Hela out of her penthouse and towards the portal hub before he took her to Japan. When they stepped out of the portal, they were in an alleyway about a block away from Akihabara in Tokyo, and it was just past noon. As they approached the main street, Ezekiel cast a spell on himself and Hela so they could understand and speak the language before he smiled and said, "Welcome to the best place on Midgard to buy anything anime or manga related." Hela looked around with interest at all of the buildings and displays, but didn't seem that excited until they walked past a window display and she asked, "What are those?" Ezekiel glanced at the display before he said, "Figurines. People like to collect them and display them in big glass display cases." Hela pointed at one as she asked, "Isn't that Char?" "Yeah. Do you want one?" Hela glanced at the figurine for a few moments before she said, "Yes." Ezekiel smirked as he waved her towards the door and said, "You have some furniture, but you didn't really buy anything else. How about you buy whatever you want here to help decorate your house with?" Hela nodded slightly in agreement before she walked into the store and proceeded to buy over 100 figurines and a bunch of other knickknacks. Once they were done, they headed to the next store, and while she didn't buy as much stuff, it was still close to 50 items, 15 of which were figurines. The trend basically repeated at each store, but it was mostly for figurines and became a little less at each store they visited. Ezekiel lost count after 300 figurines, and Hela hadn't even bought a single Gundam model kit yet. But then again, most of the places they visited only had a small selection of models she didn't care for. They just finished shopping at another collectible shop, and as they left it, Hela noticed a maid cafe next door and asked, "What's this place?" Ezekiel glanced at the name and the signboard next to the entrance before he said, "It's a maid cafe. They tend to have different themes, but the main selling point is cute girls dressed up and serving people food and drinks. They tend to do little shows, dance, sing, and other stuff at the same time." Ezekiel pointed at the sign as he said, "This one is a cosplay-themed cafe, so all the people are dressed up as anime, manga, or video game characters. It also says you can pay extra for a specific character cosplay if you like. Can we check it out?" Hela asked with interest. Ezekiel smiled as he said, "Sure." As soon as they walked inside, a girl in a bunny girl outfit greeted them and said in Japanese, "Welcome, Master and Princess. How can I serve you today?" Hela glanced towards Ezekiel as she asked in English, "The people of Midgard still know who I am?" Ezekiel couldn't help himself as he burst out laughing for a moment before he said, "No, this is just how these places are. That's why she called me Master." The girl in the bunny suit, not fully understanding English, said in broken English, "Sorry, I cannot understand English well." Ezekiel smiled towards the girl and said in perfect Japanese, "It's okay. My friend was only asking me a question. We can both speak Japanese just fine." Hela nodded as she said also in perfect Japanese, "It's my first time visiting a place like this." "Oh, it's your first time? We are honored to have you as a guest." The girl said with a slight bow before he said, "Let me show you what we offer, Princess." The girl stepped out from behind the podium she was at and pointed to the large menu on the wall as she said, "Our maid cafe is different from most places as we offer a very customizable experience for our guests. First, you will pick your room theme. Most people pick a theme that will match the cosplay their attendants will be in, but it's not a set rule or anything." The girl pointed to another list and said, "After the room comes how many maids you want and the type of cosplay they will be in for your visit." As she highlighted the cosplay list, she said, "Not every cosplay is available each day, and only the ones posted here in green are available today. Once all of that is completed, you can then customize your visit depending on your preferences. I personally recommend the karaoke package. It's one of our best sellers. The girl said as she pointed to the package and price. Ezekiel glanced over the menu before he asked, "What do you want to do?" Hela pointed to the room theme, which made Ezekiel raise an eyebrow, but said nothing as she picked a couple of cosplay that matched the theme of the room. Afterwards, she looked at the list of packages before she finally said, "The karaoke one sounds fine to me. Do you know what karaoke is?" Hela nodded as she said with confidence, "Of course I do." Ezekiel smiled before he turned to the hostess and said, "I think that should do it then." The girl smiled in return before she pointed towards a bench and said, "Please wait there, and I will notify your attendants so they can prepare." After they sat down on the bench, Ezekiel said, "So that was an interesting theme choice." Hela glanced towards Ezekiel as she said, "It sounded fun. Just because magic was in the name doesn't mean they will use magic to entertain us. In case that was what you were thinking," Ezekiel said before he noticed Hela's eyes widened for a moment. Ezekiel smirked as he said, "I thought as much. Whatever, this will still be fun." About 5 minutes later, two girls dressed up in colorful costumes, holding light-up wands approached them. Once they were close, they both did a quick little dance number before they posed together and said in sync, "We're happy to meet you both and can't wait to have a magical time together." The girl in the cute pink-colored sailor dress stood up straight and waved her wand towards the way she came as she said, "Come along, master and princess. Your adventure awaits." The girl in the blue dress happily nodded along as she added, "We have everything specially prepared for your enjoyment." Ezekiel glanced at Hela, who looked slightly disappointed before he stood up and said, "Come along, princess. Let's go have some fun." The theme Hela picked was called Magical Girl Wonderland, and the room itself didn't disappoint. It was colorful and filled with posters and wall scrolls depicting different magical girls. There were a few couches placed next to each other in the corner farthest from the door with a coffee table that could be shared in between them. Against the wall near the door was a large TV that displayed a music selection list, while the highlight of the room was a small foot-tall stage shaped like a starburst. It was about 6 feet in diameter and had LED lights installed into and around it that were currently off. Hela wasn't that impressed with what she found in the room, but her years of training paid off as she didn't show it on her face. After Hela and Ezekiel were seated and a drink order was placed, the girl in the pink costume took to the stage and struck a pose as she asked, "Are you ready to have a good time?" "Yes," Ezekiel said before he nudged Hela with his shoulder, and she said flatly, "Yes." The girl pouted cutely as she struck a pose and said, "Come on, this is supposed to be a magical party. Show some enthusiasm and let's have some fun, princess." Ezekiel nodded in agreement before the girl struck another pose and said, "Since master and princess wished for a karaoke party, I'll get the stage warmed up with the first song." The girl scrolled through the song list until she found the opening theme to Revolutionary Girl Utina, and Ronda Revolution was selected. She quickly pressed some buttons on the microphone in her hands, and the lights dimmed as the LEDs on and around the stage lit up. As the song started, the girl broke into dance as she sang along, and the opening for the anime played along on the TV with the words to the song being displayed. Ezekiel enjoyed the show, and while Hela didn't really react, she didn't complain either. After the song finished, the other girl came back with drinks, and they went into a whole routine with how they were served and doing a Momo beam to make them taste better. While Hela didn't really participate, she seemed to enjoy the show a little bit. After the drinks, the second maid picked a song and did her own dance routine as she sang before she handed the microphone to Ezekiel and said, "Please choose a song, master." Ezekiel took the microphone and scrolled through the list till he found what he wanted. After he stepped onto the stage, he hit play, and Ajamangadeo opening theme Ceramami Cake started to play. Ezekiel's voice wasn't the best, and he didn't try to make it better as he sang along to the song and danced. Partway through the song, the two hostess joined in dancing off to the side and singing off-key like Ezekiel was. Once the song finished, Ezekiel glanced towards Hela and saw a real smile on her face for the first time since they entered the maid cafe. Ezekiel stepped off the stage and handed the microphone to Hela as he said, "Now it's your turn, princess." The smile on Hela's face froze as she looked from Ezekiel to the microphone and back a couple of times. Ezekiel started to smirk as he said, "Don't be afraid now. You were the one who chose karaoke. Hela's eyes narrowed as she snatched the microphone from Ezekiel's hand and said, I am many things, but I will never be a coward. Ezekiel relaxed onto the couch as Hela selected her song before she got on stage and began to sing along as Colors by Flo played. She only sang at first, but the longer the song went, the more she got into it and even started to dance a little. Once the song ended, Ezekiel and the maids all clapped for Hela before Ezekiel stood up and said, My turn. 00198. A Day with Hela. 2 of 2. As Hela and Ezekiel enjoyed themselves at the Maid Cafe, a tense meeting was happening in another place. In a throne room coated in gold, a young-looking man with shoulder-length blonde hair glared at an older man with one eye who sat on a golden throne. The older man looked tired as he stared down at the young man before he said, It was for the good of our people. It had to be done. She's your daughter. There had to be another way. Odin let out a heavy sigh before he said, You're only a naive prince. You don't understand what it means to be a king and the burden I bear. We shouldn't judge him too harshly, brother. Another man said as he placed his hand on the blonde man's shoulder. But she's our sister. Our blood. He should have never treated her like that. He should have tried something else. Reason with her, or... Enough! Odin shouted as he slammed his spear into the ground. This is not up for debate. It's all in the past now, and I won't be lectured about my decisions by you or anyone else. Odin said before he waved towards the door and added, Leave. I've already told you everything you need to know. After Thor stormed out of the throne room, he turned towards Loki and said, We should go find our sister and talk to her. Loki frowned as he said, You heard what he said, dear brother. She's dangerous. I refuse to believe that. She can't be as bad as he described. At least I wish to find out for myself and then decide what to do. Fine, I'll follow your lead then. Loki said with a helpless smile. Thor placed a hand on Loki's shoulder as he said, Great, let's go find our sister. Thor started to walk with purpose before he stopped, turned to Loki and asked, Where should we start? Loki let out a sigh before he said, Let's go check with Heimdall and have him search for her first. Didn't he already try and said that he couldn't find any trace of her? Loki smirked as he said, I have a few ideas we can try that might help him in his search. Thor laughed boisterously as he slapped Loki hard on the back, which made Loki stumble forward before he said, As expected of you, brother. Loki shot a glare at Thor as he said, Can you settle down, you oaf? Sorry, I'm just excited to meet my sister. Thor said before he laughed some more. As Loki and Thor went off to search for Hela, she was having a great time singing Kessenai Tsumi by Nana Kidade at the Maid Cafe. Over the next hour or so, Hela and Ezekiel took turns singing along with the maids taking over when they wanted a break. When they were finished, Ezekiel paid for everything, and while he wanted to leave both girls a tip, he knew it would be refused because Japan doesn't have a tipping culture and it's kind of considered rude. After they left the cafe, they stopped by a few more stores where Hela bought more stuff until they reached a store that only sold Gunpla models. As they walked into the store, Hela paused at a large display with a couple of customized and painted models locked in battle. They were the centerpieces of a diorama filled with tanks, jets, and soldiers set in an urban landscape. Hela studied it with interest before she asked, Is this a model kit? No, this is a bunch of model kits and a ton of other stuff that might be custom-made, Ezekiel said as he looked over the models. Ezekiel pointed to one of the Gundams before he picked up a model kit next to the diorama and said, This is the model they used for the base. But whoever made it modified it. You see the arms and legs? Those are all modifications. Hela noticed what Ezekiel pointed out as she asked, You can do that? Ezekiel smirked as he said, Of course you can. It's what most model builders do to make cooler things and give themselves more of a challenge. As they headed deeper into the store, Hela saw custom models on display throughout the store. The more she saw, the more she realized the model kits Ezekiel gave her were pretty much the very base level of the hobby. Most of them were simple to build and used only a single color of plastic and a handful of stickers. The higher-end models were made of 5 or more colored plastics, had more stickers, and were generally more labor-intensive to build. But beyond that was all the extras you could do to make the models even better, like painting, modifying, adding lights, crafting dioramas with them, and more. Needless to say, Hela was excited about making a higher-end model kit and even painting it. By the time they left the store, Hela had picked up at least 2 of each kit they had in stock. Along with everything else, she would need to customize models. Paints, brushes, a spray gun, markers, air compressor, razors, sandpaper, basically anything she might need, even if it wasn't necessary. They ended up going to a few more Gunpla-only stores to collect more models and stuff needed for the hobby. After that, they went to a couple of hobby stores so Hela could get foam board, fake grass, bushes, fake trees, and tons of other things. They even stopped by a hobby store for model trains to pick up buildings and other things so she could create dioramas with. Once everything was said and done, Hela had enough stuff to fill up 2 or 3 rooms. Well, normal-sized bedrooms. But the main living room and entryway to Hela's penthouse was massive. So after Ezekiel finished pulling everything out of his storage seal, it was a little chaotic. But Hela could easily walk around without issue and store everything however she wanted in some of the extra bedrooms she had. After Ezekiel finished, he checked the time before he said, "Well, that was a fun day, but I should get out of here." Hela looked up from sorting through some of her stuff as she asked with a hint of disappointment, "You have to go?" "Yeah. It's about dinner time for my family, and I haven't seen them in a couple of days," Ezekiel said as he rubbed the back of his head. "Oh, would it be okay to meet them?" "Maybe," Hela asked with a hint of nervousness in her voice. Ezekiel forced a smile as he said, "You meeting my family would cause a lot of issues for me." "I understand," Hela said with a sad smile. Ezekiel let out a sigh before he said, "No, you don't. And it's my fault. I told you this was my second life, but I never told you how long I've been alive for," Ezekiel said as he lifted his arm up and touched something on it before he ripped it off, and a cloud of smoke appeared. Theo stepped out of the smoke as he said, "This is what I really look like. My full name is Theodore Ezekiel Mercer, and I turn 12 in a couple months." Hela stared at Theo for a few moments before she asked in a hurt tone, "Why didn't you tell me this sooner?" "I planned to tell you sooner, but hell wasn't really secure like this place is, and I didn't want to risk the safety of my family. Unlike me, my family are baseline humans, and I don't want to put them in danger," Theo said before another puff of smoke appeared, and he turned back into Ezekiel. "I'm sorry if I upset you, but the safety of my family comes before anything else. It's the reason why I've only told 2 other people about my real identity besides you. Don't forget Fury." Both Hela and Ezekiel whipped their heads around to see Tao and Agatha seated on the couch eating popcorn. "When did you get here, and how?" Ezekiel asked in confusion. "Don't stop now. You were both putting on a great show," Tao said with a smirk as she grabbed another handful of popcorn. Ezekiel pinched the bridge of his nose as he said, "I really am a bad influence on both of you." Agatha waved him off as she said, "We were just curious about what you 2 were doing on your date, so we followed you in the mirror dimension to watch. We almost joined you for karaoke, but didn't want to intrude." Tao nodded in agreement before she said, "Theo needs more practice, but you did a pretty good job, Hela." Hela went through a range of emotions along with Ezekiel finding out that they were spied on the whole day. Ezekiel finally shook his head before he glanced at Hela and said, "Again, I'm sorry for not telling you sooner, but I'll figure out a way to make it up to you." Hela nodded slightly before Ezekiel turned towards Tao and Agatha with a glare as he said, "As for you 2 voyeurs, I hope you don't do that again. That's on a level of creepy that's worse than Jiraiya. Don't compare us to that pervert," Agatha said, which made Tao nod in agreement before she added, "We were just curious and wanted to see what you would do. It wasn't bad, but you definitely have room for improvement on your next date." Ezekiel started to reply when he noticed Tao and Agatha's teasing smiles. He shook his head as he said, "I hate both of you." Ezekiel turned towards Hela and said, "I'll visit you tomorrow sometime and bring you a cell phone so you can contact me whenever you want. And a computer too." Hela nodded as she said, "I'll see you tomorrow then." After Ezekiel left, Tao stood up and asked Hela, "You want to go eat an early dinner with us?" "I'm not really hungry." "Pity, we were going to talk to you about Theo. But if you're not hungry, maybe we can do it another time," Agatha said as she stood up from the couch. "Well, I guess I could use a snack," Hela said as she put down the model kit in her hands. Hours later, while Tao, Agatha, and Hela were still talking with each other, Ezekiel created a portal to Tony's workshop to find him about a new project. While he didn't really need to find Tony, since he barely left the house these days, it was mostly because Pepper was so pregnant and they were trying to hide it. They still went out about once a week, but only when Ezekiel gave them hinge seals to change their appearance. Well, mostly Pepper to make her look not pregnant, but they both used them a few times to go out and blend in. While Tony loved the attention he got from people recognizing him, he had to admit it was nice to go out and be unnoticed sometimes. Or as Tony called it, be a normal person. Tony was at his computer as Ezekiel stepped out of the portal and said, "Yo, I need you to design something for me." Tony spun around in his chair as he said, "I feel like the only reason you come by is to ask me to do stuff for you." "That isn't true. It's like 60% of the reason." Tony folded his arms over his chest as he asked, "And what's the other 40% for?" Ezekiel tilted his head up and rubbed his chin for a few moments before he snapped his fingers as he looked at Tony and said, "To mess with you, of course. I don't want you as a friend anymore." "Oh, don't say that. You wouldn't be together with Pepper and about to have a kid if it wasn't for me," Ezekiel said as he moved towards Tony's desk. "Ezekiel is right. The statistical chance of you and Miss Potts getting together was less than 1%. Jarvis said before he added, "Welcome, Ezekiel." "Thank you for the help, Jarvis." "Bullshit. There is no way the chance was that low. Me and Pepper get along great," Tony said with a frown. "Then how come you didn't get together sooner?" Ezekiel asked as he took a seat on the workbench next to Tony's desk. "That's because..." Ezekiel cut Tony off as he said, "That's because you were an egotistical man whore who drank all the time. You're still egotistical, but it's not as bad as it used to be." Tony rolled his eyes before he said, "Fine. I'll admit you might have helped a little bit in getting us together, but it would have happened eventually." Ezekiel shrugged as he said, "Maybe, maybe not. There's no way to know what would have happened if I didn't come along." "That's true. Anyways, why'd you come by?" Ezekiel pulled out his phone and tapped something on the screen before he said, "Jarvis, please pull up that file I just sent Tony." Tony glanced towards the file on the screen before he looked back at Ezekiel and said, "You can't be serious. I just need a design that's buildable." Tony glanced at the file as he said, "Even with the stuff I've learned from alien technology, it wouldn't work correctly. I just need a good working design. Whether or not the technology exists yet to build it doesn't matter." "Then why do you want me to design it in the first place?" Tony asked as he looked over the file some more. "Curiosity more than anything else. I mean, even if it's not currently feasible, that doesn't mean we might not be able to figure it out sooner or later." Tony shook his head as he said, "To have something like this run for more than a minute would take a massive power supply, or you would have to have it hooked up to some type of external power unit, which would defeat the purpose of making it." Ezekiel smirked as he said, "Just design it with a spot for the power supply near the chest, and make it about the size of a grapefruit." Tony narrowed his eyes as he looked at Ezekiel and asked, "Did you already figure out the power supply issue?" Ezekiel shook his head as he said, "No, but I have a few ideas on how to solve it." "Really? What's your idea?" "Take that arc reactor you built and make it smaller," Ezekiel said with a smile. Tony thought about it as he looked over the design before he said, "It still won't work. Even if I shrink that down, it would lose power the smaller it gets." Tony started to type on his computer for a few moments before he pointed at it and said, "An arc reactor the size of a grapefruit wouldn't even have enough power to run an electric car for a few minutes, let alone this thing. Like I said, just get me a design that's buildable." Tony waved him off as he said, "Fine, I'll design something for you, but I still think it's a waste of time. Your complaint is noted and ignored. Now get to work, slave," Ezekiel said with a teasing smile. Tony flipped Ezekiel off as he said, "Fuck off and go get me some food while you're at it." Ezekiel dropped off of the workbench and headed towards the door to go upstairs as he said, "If I'm getting food, I'll go ask Pepper and Happy what they want to eat and bring you the leftovers." "No way. I asked first," Tony said in protest as Ezekiel opened the door. "Did you hear anything, Jarvis?" Ezekiel asked as he walked out of the room. "I did not, sir." "All right, just checking," Tony heard Ezekiel say before the door closed. Tony dropped his head onto his desk as he mumbled to himself, "I need better friends." 00199, Clown Show. It was early in the morning as Theo prepared for the day ahead. He created a clone that would cover for him at school since today he had to go meet a bunch of idiots and have his time wasted. He could have probably sent a clone to take care of it, but his mom was going to be there and he figured he might as well tag along. After he created his clone, he headed to his training room to get ready. Well, he didn't really need to do anything to get ready besides hinge into Ezekiel. But after he did that, he portaled to the building he currently used as Vibe's headquarters to wait for his mom to arrive. It was about half an hour later that Daniel stepped out of the elevator dressed in a sleek business suit. Ezekiel, on the other hand, wore his normal hinge attire, which consisted of black dress slacks and a gray and blue pattern button-up shirt. Once Daniel was closer and looked over Ezekiel, she said, "You should probably change into something a little nicer for this." Ezekiel stood up from his desk as he asked, "You really don't think this is fine? You're dressed in something my son would wear," Daniel said with a flat look. "Then it sounds like he has good taste." Ezekiel said with a smirk, "He does. But he's also a kid. You should be better dressed than him." Ezekiel let out a sigh before he changed his hinge into better-looking clothes. He now wore an elegant three-piece suit in all black, with gray stitching, a gray vest, white undershirt, and a blood-red tie. Daniel looked him over for a few moments before she said, "That's better. If you're ready, let's head over there." Ezekiel nodded before he created a portal and stepped through it, followed by Daniel. They stepped out onto the sidewalk outside of a building in Capitol Hill, which caused a bit of a commotion from the people nearby. After the portal closed, Ezekiel walked up to the building with Daniel, who asked, "Was that really necessary?" Ezekiel glanced around at everyone staring at them as he said, "If I didn't make a portal, we wouldn't have gotten here on time. I only agreed to take a portal because I thought you would make one in a discreet location, not right in front of the building," Daniel said in a slightly annoyed tone. Ezekiel smirked as he asked, "Have I ever made a portal in a discreet location before?" After a few moments, Daniel let out a sigh before she said, No, you haven't." Ezekiel opened the door to the Senate building as he said, "Exactly. If I'm going to do something, I'm going to do it flashy." After getting inside, checking in, and going through security, they were led through the building to the room for the hearing. The room they entered was pretty empty compared to its capacity, and none of the senators that called the hearing were in the room yet. The aide that was their guide led them to the front of the room where a table was set up for them to use, before they excused themselves to take care of other duties. Ezekiel glanced around the room for a moment and the few people in the room before he said, "I kind of expected the room to be filled with people and news crews." Daniel was in the middle of pulling out documents from her briefcase as she said, "I didn't see it posted on the website this morning, so they might be trying to keep this hearing out of the public eye." Ezekiel nodded in understanding before he smirked as he said, "I wonder what they'll do when they realize the whole thing is being live-streamed on Vibe. I still don't think that's a good idea. It could cause issues down the line for you and the company," Daniel said as she finished putting all of her documents out on the table. "Something already happened. That's why we're here in the first place. People don't like it when you mess with their free meal," Ezekiel said as he relaxed in his chair. Daniel let out a sigh before she said, "That's true. I still can't believe they think calling you in for this isn't going to backfire on them." Ezekiel smirked again as he said, "That's why this place is empty, and I am pretty sure no one is going to be in here taking minutes for this clown show, which means live streaming it is the last thing they will want." Ezekiel and Daniel chatted for a little while until people started to enter the room and fill up the seats in the gallery area. Ezekiel glanced at them for a moment, surprised that people were showing up, before he pulled his tablet out of his storage seal and started to type on it. After a few moments, he said, "Well, that's a little bit of a surprise." Daniel glanced at Ezekiel's tablet as she asked, "What is?" "Everyone filling up the room are competitors. Well, they at least work for them in one way or another. This is going to be a lot more fun than I thought." Daniel cast a quick glance at the audience section before she turned around in her seat and said, "You sure know how to make enemies. These people aren't my enemies, just misguided fools at best. They think this is going to stop me or scare me into backing down, when all it's really doing is wasting my time," Ezekiel said as he typed away on his tablet. Ezekiel typed away on his tablet for a few more minutes as members of the committee started to enter the room with their entourages. After half an hour, the room was completely filled, and an older man who sat in the middle of the committee's table banged a small gavel before he said, "It looks like everyone is here. I would like to call this meeting to order. Before we begin, I would like to thank everyone for coming today to this Senate Oversight Committee hearing on Revival's potential monopoly on the insurance industry and the effects it has already made on its competitors." The older man looked towards Ezekiel as he said, "Thank you for accepting the summons, mister. Actually, I don't believe we have a last name for you on file. Because I don't have one. Ezekiel said as he placed his tablet down on the table in front of him and looked up with a smile. The man nodded slightly before he said, "All right, Mr. Ezekiel." "Just Ezekiel is fine, Senator Klein." Klein nodded again before he turned to Daniel and said, "And I would like to thank you for also coming, Mrs. Mercer, even though legal counsel wasn't needed for this hearing." "Thank you for inviting us, Senator," Daniel said with a hint of a smile. "Before we begin, I would like to make my opening statement and then open the floor to my fellow committee chairs to make opening statements if they so wish." What followed was over half an hour of pure bullshit as each chair member made statements talking about how monopolies were bad and giving people options and choices was good for not only the consumer but America in general. Once all the roosters had their chance to shine and puff out their chests, a roll call was held. Afterwards, Klein turned to Ezekiel and Daniel and asked, "Pursuant to Committee Rule 9G, can I ask you to stand and raise your right hand?" After Ezekiel and Daniel stood up with their hands raised, Klein asked, "Do you solemnly swear or affirm that the testimony you are about to give is the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth? So help you God?" "I do," both Daniel and Ezekiel said at the same time. "Thank you. You may take your seat now." Klein pulled out some papers and looked them over for a moment before he glanced at Ezekiel and asked, "Ezekiel, can you tell me when you created Revival Incorporated?" "You'll have to refer to my legal counsel for that information." Klein frowned slightly as he asked, "Surely you can answer something simple like this?" Ezekiel shrugged as he said, "I have a lawyer with me who I pay a ridiculous amount of money to for just this type of situation. I might as well get my money's worth." Klein tried to get Ezekiel to answer a few more questions, but when he kept directing everything to Daniel, Klein gave up on asking him and started directing the questions to Daniel. Over the next 2 hours, without any real break, the committee members asked the most pointless questions over and over again. Sure, they were phrased differently, or something was changed to make it seem a little different. But overall, they were the same questions, and it was getting annoying. Even Daniel, with all of her experience, was getting annoyed. At least Ezekiel assumed she was, because she would frown the tiniest bit whenever they repeated a question at this point. The only thing keeping Ezekiel in check was the live stream chat that was making fun of all the senators as they kept trying to get Daniel with the same questions. Ezekiel had it pulled up on his tablet and would look at it from time to time and smile slightly. As for why no one in the room even knew about the live stream or were warned that it was happening, Ezekiel sealed the building from letting anyone else get cell service and also blocked the entrances to the room the committee was in. Anyone who moved towards the room with the intent to enter was placed under a Jinjutsu by the guards he posted and then placed to rest in an unoccupied room they borrowed. Everything was going smooth so far until Klein asked, "Mrs. Mercer, don't you think that with Revival's current pricing structure, that it's completely unfair to other businesses in the insurance industry? A pricing structure so low that it's impossible for other companies to compete fairly with Revival?" It was another repeated question, just framed a little differently. Before Daniel could respond, Ezekiel asked, "Sure, it's low, but can you explain how it's unfair? Can't they just lower prices to match it?" Daniel glanced at Ezekiel with a questioning look as he shrugged and said, "They've asked this same question 5 times now like a broken record and didn't like your response. I figured I would try something different this time." Klein took only a moment before he said, "Your company's pricing model is too low, and if it doesn't change, you will be the only insurance provider on the market, which would turn it into a monopoly, which we will not allow. And I fail to see how that's my problem. If anything, you should be telling the other companies to lower their prices to match mine so it doesn't happen." Klein glanced at some papers in front of him for a few moments before he said, "No normal business can be expected to make any type of profit with the prices you charge, let alone pay out insurance claims properly. It's funny you mentioned that, since I wasn't running this business for profit." Klein frowned slightly as he asked, "Why would you create a business if you aren't looking to make it profitable?" "Because no one has the right to profit off of human lives. And that's exactly how the current insurance industry works." Ezekiel glanced over his shoulder and jabbed a thumb towards the people seated in the guest area as he said, "How many of them sell insurance to people, but when something happens and they are supposed to pay out, they drag their feet and wait till the last moment to pay out a claim? Or better yet, they just deny the claim outright or cancel the policy because they know a normal person can't sue them or doesn't have the time and money to sue them." Ezekiel turned back to the committee and said, I created Revival Insurance with the people behind Revival after reaching an agreement with them, and they feel the same way I do about the current insurance industry. Revival Insurance was made with the sole purpose of putting people like them and the companies they work for out of business. If that somehow turns Revival into a monopoly, then that just means we did our job correctly. Ezekiel said with a feral grin as he pointed to the people behind him. Klein frowned slightly at that comment before he said, like I said before, we won't allow that to happen. America doesn't allow companies to form a monopoly. We will take you to court if you don't change your pricing model and compete fairly with the other competitors in the industry. Ezekiel chuckled before he said, if you want the majority of public opinion to be against you, go right ahead, Senator. I don't think it will help you get reelected, though. Do you think this is a joke? I already have documents drafted to take you to court pending the outcome of this hearing. If you don't comply, Revival will be forced to halt business until the court case is over. Klein said with a hint of conceit in his voice. It is a joke. The fact you think the threat of going to court will make me back down is laughable at best. Ezekiel was about to say something else when a man in Umbu gear appeared next to him in a small flash of light with a red and white fox mask on. The man leaned down and whispered, Code Green is a go. Who is that? How did they get in here? Klein asked as everyone stared at the man, and Ezekiel's eyes widened slightly before he asked, He already did it? He just talked with Ross and is driving to the lab to do it now. We have half an hour at best. Ezekiel nodded in understanding as he said, Go get the others ready. I'll be there in 5. The man disappeared in another flash as Ezekiel stood up and said, As much as I want to stay here all day and waste time, an important matter came up and I need to go. Klein frowned as he said, We're not done here. If you leave, we will take legal actions. And who was that person? How did they get inside? Daniel was already packing her things as Ezekiel glanced at Klein and said, That was part of my security detail, and as you saw, he teleported in and out of the room. It's not hard to tell what happened. Klein shared some looks with other members on the committee as Ezekiel typed a few things on his tablet before he stored it away. Ezekiel's eyes changed color, and he swept his gaze over all the members of the committee before he did the same thing to everyone in the guest area. Everyone took on a slightly vacant expression as Ezekiel said, I want each person here to be completely honest about what is going on here and disclose any involvement they have with it one at a time, starting with Senator Klein. After you confess to any crimes you've committed in your life, you can leave the room. Daniel frowned as Klein started to talk about the bribes he received to call the committee hearing together before she said, You shouldn't have done whatever this is. You just made a lot of powerful enemies. Ezekiel waved off her concern as he said, I already told you. These people aren't strong enough to be my enemies. They're an annoyance at most. Besides, after today, I doubt any of them will be able to keep their jobs after this. Good thing it's an election year for the Senate. Ezekiel said before he created a portal to his offices for him and Daniel. The live stream kept going after Ezekiel left as each person took turns and exposed themselves to the world. Klein, the first person to talk, left the room, and once outside, he headed to his office where his office phone was going crazy. His personal assistant was still at the committee meeting as she had yet to talk, so he answered the phone to find someone yelling at him to go back to the meeting room and stop whatever was happening there. Klein was still in a slight daze when he first picked up the phone, but as he listened to the person on the other end, the color drained from his face. He dropped the phone in a panic as he rushed back to the meeting room only to be knocked out as he approached the room, like everyone else who was trying to stop what was happening. 00200.smart, but stupid? Ezekiel arrived before Banner and started going over the safeties he put in place. Most of them were magical in nature and created with help for Tao or Agatha. They were mostly runic wards around the area that would contain the blast from the experiment if Banner went through with it, that is. After Ezekiel finished, he went over to one of the desks and pulled out his tablet to check over the fall out of the live stream while he waited for Banner to show up. Ezekiel wasn't disappointed in the slightest as most news organizations were covering the committee meeting live stream that was still going on. Sure, some of them were trying to downplay the whole thing, and some even tried to make him look like a bad guy. Something about him being a meta-human with mind-controlling powers, and that whatever was being said currently couldn't be trusted. Even with that, the overall reception was positive and normal people liked what Revival was doing. The only real bad news was someone in Klein's camp immediately filed the lawsuit against Revival. As for the lawsuit and it affecting Revival and its insurance business, Ezekiel already had a contingency plan in place if they tried to stop the business from running. Well, it was more like he would keep running the business and not worry about it. Sure, they could stop by the offices and try to shut them down with court orders and other things. But Revival only had a single-room office where a clone of his would hang out. Everything was done online with the help of software and clones that normally worked from his training facility or the secret base. Sure, the clones would need to answer calls and handle in-person inspections for business claims, but most things were done through an online portal that was easy to use. Could the government try to shut it down and block it? Sure, they could try, but it wouldn't work, just like the live stream people were trying to stop. As Ezekiel was working on his tablet, Banner entered the secure laboratory and didn't notice Ezekiel, who was off to one side of the lab, partly hidden from view. As Banner started to boot up a couple of machines and mumble to himself, Ezekiel put away his tablet and stepped into the main area of the lab as he said, what's up, Doc?" Banner, who looked a lot more like the comic book version, instantly spun around to look at Ezekiel with widened eyes as he asked, "You again?" Ezekiel nodded his head as he said, "Yup, it's me again. So planning to rush your experiment, huh? I already warned you. It won't end well if you do that." Banner frowned slightly and turned around to continue working as he said, "I have to do it. I have no other choice. For a guy with so many PhDs, I thought you would be smarter." Banner shot a small glare at Ezekiel as he kept preparing for the experiment and said, "I've run the simulations millions of times. The experiment will work. I've just been putting off live testing because I wanted to get more data points just in case we missed something." Ezekiel moved to one of the desks and sat on it as he said, "I'm surprised you haven't called security yet. The last time you pushed that button by now. I've already been threatened with the cancellation of the project if I don't show real results soon. If I alert security at this point, the project will be canceled today. It doesn't help that the only evidence of your last visit was me," Banner said in an annoyed tone. Ezekiel smirked slightly as he said, "At least they upped the security a little, even though they found no evidence anyone was ever here besides you and Betty." Banner glanced over at Ezekiel as he moved over to check the experiment table underneath a large device that hung from the ceiling and said, "Yeah, thanks for that, by the way. They almost canceled the whole project after that incident." Ezekiel chuckled a little before he said, "That was honestly hilarious. The fact they thought you were hallucinating from overwork just made it even better. I was forced to take a 2-week vacation because of that." Banner said in a frustrated tone, "You say that like it's a bad thing. It put me behind on the project, and I had to do simulations on my home computer the whole time, which took 10 times longer than normal." Banner said in an annoyed tone, "You had 2 weeks of vacation from work and wasted it on more work. How Betty even puts up with you, I'll never understand." Banner turned towards Ezekiel with a glare as he asked, "What's that supposed to mean? You had 2 weeks to do anything and could have easily spent it with Betty. Instead, you did what? You wasted it on working," Ezekiel said with a shrug. Banner frowned again and turned back to his work as he said, "I am doing this so me and Betty can be together." "Wow, you really are afraid of Ross's threat to separate you from Betty." Banner whipped back around as he asked, "How do you know about that?" Ezekiel raised an eyebrow as he asked, "Why do you ask the dumbest questions when you're supposed to be so smart? Or is it the trait of geniuses to have no common sense?" Banner frowned as Ezekiel said, "I told you last time I could see the future. I showed up today because I knew you would attempt your experiment, and I wanted to warn you again not to do it." Banner turned back around as he started putting some information into his main computer as he said, "It's too late for that." "Why?" "Because you think Betty would really follow her dad's order to distance herself from you. Wouldn't she? She's extremely close with her father. She would have no reason to refuse," Banner said as he used a machine to start mixing some chemicals together. "I swear, you are more dense than a black hole," Ezekiel said as he shook his head. Banner glanced up from the machine after he finished inputting commands and asked, "What are you talking about now?" "You, not realizing Betty is completely in love with you, and if forced to choose, she would choose to stay with you instead of her father," Ezekiel said as he pinched the bridge of his nose. Banner stopped working for a few moments before he shook his head and started powering up another machine as he said, "You're wrong. Her father is the only family she has. She would never choose me over him. I give up, you're a lost cause. Just do your experiment and see how well it goes for you. Ezekiel said as he pulled out his tablet and started to type on it. Banner glanced up with a frown as he said, "If you know the future, you should just tell me how the experiment goes instead of telling me not to do it." Ezekiel looked up from his tablet as he asked, "Would knowing the results stop you in any way? Does the experiment fail or kill me?" Ezekiel shook his head as he said, "No, but it will change your life forever." Banner paused as he was entering data into a machine before he looked up at Ezekiel and asked, "In a good or bad way?" "Mostly good," Ezekiel said as he thought over what he knew of the Hulk and Banner. Banner turned his attention back to the machine in front of himself as he said, "Then I am not going to worry about it." Ezekiel worked on his tablet as Banner went about the lab and finished getting everything ready. Once the serum Banner created was ready, Ezekiel put his tablet away and said, "Well, I would say good luck, but you don't really need it." Banner glanced up from loading the serum into a syringe and asked, "Oh, you're still here?" Ezekiel shook his head with a slight smirk before he started to fade away as he said, "Catch you on the flip side, Doc." Banner glanced around the room for a moment before he went back to getting ready. Ezekiel was outside the lab next to a handful of people in Umbu gear as he asked, "Is everything in place?" "We've double-checked the entire building and the surrounding area. No one is currently within the vicinity, and everyone is on patrol to stop people from entering." Minato with his fox mask on said, "What about the secondary target?" "Already under surveillance and can be picked up at any time," Minato said as he glanced towards another person down the hallway and asked, "Do we really need him if this place is going to blow up already?" Ezekiel glanced at the other person who was in the process of placing explosives and said, "The seals I placed will contain the explosion and the gamma radiation. Once it's cleaned out, we will need his powers to make the rest of the building explode properly." Minato nodded in understanding before he said, "I know. I just feel like we could have used normal explosives instead of him. His explosives are undetectable. Sure, they might have some suspicions, but without trace evidence, they will have to drop it and rule it as an accident with Banner's experiment. Besides, he isn't that bad," Ezekiel said before the man made a small clay sculpture and asked the clay sculpture, "You're going to make a beautiful piece of art, aren't you?" "Okay, maybe he is a little eccentric," Ezekiel said with a forced smile. The lights in the hallway started to dim, which made Ezekiel glance towards Banner's lab as he said, "You guys get to a safe distance just in case the shield doesn't contain the blast." As Minato disappeared in a flash of light, Ezekiel's body broke apart into mirror fragments as he entered the mirror dimension. Ezekiel quickly moved back into Banner's lab to find the man strapped down to a gurney as he injected a serum into his arm. Afterwards, he pressed a button, and the lights in the lab dimmed as the machine above Banner powered up. Banner was sweating like crazy and his veins were bulging as the machine started to move. There was a ring around it that started to slowly spin as the machine started to hum with power, and a green light emanated from the tip. Banner looked to be in physical pain as the machine above him got louder and the focus ring spun faster. It took almost a minute before the machine finished its charging routine and fired a blast of green light at Banner. Banner let out a pained scream as the light fully covered his body for a few moments before the machine started to smoke. It was hard to see through the green light that lit up the room, but Ezekiel could see Banner's body grow at random and even look to turn green sometimes. About half a minute in, alarms started going off as the main gamma laser above Banner started to spark and overload. A few moments later, the machine exploded in a massive blast of gamma radiation that filled the room along with smoke and fire. A massive roar in front of Ezekiel cleared the area of smoke for a moment to show Banner now transformed into the Hulk. Ezekiel looked up at the massive green monster in front of him at that moment and smiled.